Hi, my name is John Stevenson, and I'd like to take you on a trip to the world of the Old Testament. We begin by looking at a map of the Middle East, the place where Europe and Africa and Asia all come together in this one place where they all touch each other, the land of the Middle East. And the first thing we notice is that this is the area of what we've called the Fertile Crescent, an area of relative fertility stretching the entire length of the Nile River that goes far to the south in southern Africa, and then follows the course of some very small river systems like the Jordan and the Orontes River, and then are taken in by the area that we know as Mesopotamia, which are comprised by the two very large rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. So as we look at this, we see both Egypt and Mesopotamia, two great centers of civilization that grew up along these two very major river systems. In the middle of that is going to be little tiny Israel. I just spoke of two great civilizations. I will mention a third one in passing. It's mentioned several times in the Bible, but the biblical story isn't really going to focus so much on Hatti. So I have Egypt along the Nile. I have various civilizations that grew up in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, remember, is just what the area between the rivers called, and you're going to have places like Babylon and Assyria. And then the kingdom of the Hittites, or Hatti as they would have said back then, located in modern-day Turkey. There is therefore between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and we'll even include Hatti, a land bridge which bypasses the desert and gives a way of egress between these three great civilization centers. Located in the middle of that land bridge is going to be the land of Canaan, or eventually, as it will come to be known, the land of Israel. So we are going to become familiar with a number of different civilizations and people groups that enter into our Old Testament story. First, there is Egypt, the land of the pyramids, and of course, by the time that we read about Abraham going to Egypt, the pyramids are already hundreds and hundreds of years old. But Egypt is going to be a central player, and it will be from Egypt that the Israelites come and then settle into the land. Over to the east, we have the kingdom of Assyria with its capital of Nineveh right on the Tigris River. Further to the west, we have the Hittites. As we said, they're going to have some impact upon Israel. We'll see people like Uriah the Hittite, and we'll see them mentioned a few times, but they're really going to be on the periphery of our biblical story. A more central player in the Bible will be the city of Babylon. In fact, it will be initially known by just the term Babel. Babel and Babylon will be exactly the same place. In fact, if you read in the Hebrew text, you read Babel in our English translation of Genesis chapter 11. A bit later in the Bible, you read about Babylon. The Hebrew text writes them both exactly the same. So I don't care if you call it Babel or Babylon, it's the same place. A few other locations we ought to mention in passing. One would be the country of Aram. Perhaps you've heard it noted that one of the early languages spoken, especially toward the end of the Old Testament era and even in New Testament times, was the language of Aramaic. Aram is that country that today we call Syria, but that's a later Roman designation. Throughout most of its history, it was called Aram, with its capital in Damascus. We also ought to make mention of the Phoenicians, because these are the next door neighbors to Israel. Whereas Israel had come out of the Sinai desert from Egypt to the Sinai and always looked sort of to the desert, their speech and their outlook and their description of things sort of had a desert quality to them. By contrast, the Phoenicians were more oriented toward the sea. They had these wonderful, great cedars of Lebanon, and they have several natural harbors further up the coast from Canaan and that caused them to be a seagoing people, and we're going to see that they developed colonies all throughout the Mediterranean. Now we're going to focus down upon the land of Canaan itself. Notice we have a very gradual slope of the coast, not too much in the way of natural harbors. As we start from the Mediterranean and work our way east, we're going to see that the land rises very gradually along that coastal plain. And as you look toward the east, you first see a rise of foothills rising up from that plain, known as the Shephelah, and then a bit past that you have a central mountain range. This central mountain range runs the entire length of Canaan with a small break at a place that we call the Valley of Jezreel. We'll come and talk about that in just a moment. We'll look back at that. Continuing toward the east, I have the Jordan Rift Valley, this great geological valley that goes down starting from the Lebanon Mountains and works its way down so that it is entirely below sea level. You get to the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee is about 600 feet below sea level, and the Jordan River flows into that in the upper Jordan and then out of it in the lower Jordan, and then continues to work its way downhill until it reaches the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea today is about 1,400 feet below sea level. You know, when I first started teaching the Bible back in, it was about 40 plus years ago, I used to say that the Dead Sea was 1,200 feet below sea level, and it was, I was correct, but in the last 40 plus years, it has actually sunk another 200 feet. So today it's around 1,400 feet below sea level. I want to show you this one picture. This is compliments of National Geographic, both this one and the next one. A very old picture. This probably is about 40 years old when I first started teaching the Bible. An aerial view of the Jordan River as it very gradually winds its way toward the south from the Sea of Galilee, moving down toward the Dead Sea. And you can see there's a very striking difference between that area that would be regularly flooded every springtime by the melting snows and the rising water versus those areas that didn't get quite so much water, that those arid lands on either side of the Jordan. As you finally get down toward the Dead Sea, and that's what we're seeing in this particular map, further to the north, you know, at the top of the photo, you can see where it's been doing its winding, very gradually making its way southward. But finally, as it gets to the Dead Sea, the river sort of straightens up and then flows into the Dead Sea. Of course, the reason why the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea is because it has a very heavy salt content, 5 times, at least 5 times, that of the ocean. So if you jump into the Dead Sea, you're not going to go swimming underwater. In fact, you bob a bit like a cork. As we continue making our way to the east from the Jordan Rift Valley, now we find ourselves in the Transjordanian Plateau. Again, this is around 2,000 to 3,000 feet above sea level, and that's going to eventually give way to the northern part of the Saudi Desert. I made mention of a valley that bisected that central mountain range. That valley is known as the Valley of Jezreel. Here we take a look at the Valley of Jezreel, and I'm standing on the site of the ancient city of Megiddo, looking across that wide open valley. You can see there's something of a town on the other side. It's today grown up into a small city even. It's the ancient town of Nazareth, where Jesus would eventually grow up into his adulthood. And this wide open valley is going to be the scene of countless armies and conflicts throughout the Bible and even in secular history, which will make reference to these areas. So we have the Valley of Jezreel as one of the things that bisects that mountain range. The other thing we ought to notice is some of the key rivers that flow into the Jordan. Now, I'll make mention of the Yarmuk, although the Old Testament doesn't actually speak of the Yarmuk, but there are some things that take place still in that general area. The rivers that are mentioned in the Bible, as I work my way further south on the east side of the Jordan River, there's that land of Gilead. Whenever you hear the name Gilead, whether it's a place called Ramoth Gilead or Jabesh Gilead, you know that Gilead is on the east side of the Jordan River. Just sort of keep that in the back of your mind. But working my way southward, I come next, there's the Yarmuk. I work my way south, and I come to the Jabbok River. And the Jabbok River, the word Jabbok means to wrestle. You can sort of imagine what takes place on the Jabbok River. Yes, that's the place where Jacob wrestled with the angel. Now, if you go to the Jabbok today, they've built a nice dam that helps to create something of a lake, and they're using it to help manufacture electricity, and that's a wonderful thing. But that Jabbok still flows there today and still has that same name that testifies to the Jacob story of he and his wrestling match with the Lord. I continue to work my way to the south, and I come to the next large river system, that is the Arnon River. The Arnon River was the northern boundary of the land of Moab. And this river system has formed a great canyon, so that if you're moving from north to south, there's a picture of the Arnon. As you're moving from north to south, it actually will hinder your travel, and you'll have to make a very large detour around the Arnon. That's exactly what the Israelites are going to do when they move up past the land of Moab to come in the days of Joshua, or leading up to the days of Joshua, the last days of Moses, when they come up to get ready to enter the promised land. Now, there are several major roads that run through the land of Canaan. First of all, there is the King's Highway. As it works its way from Damascus, it moves, and there are the roads, it moves along the coast through the valley of Jezreel, and it passes near an ancient city, a fort called Megiddo, and then works its way along the way of the Philistines as it winds its way to Egypt. The other major road is the King's Highway that splits from the way of the Philistines, and the King's Highway works its way south, paralleling the Jordan Rift Valley as it moves down to the south, eventually taking you all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba. And these were the two major roads in the land of Canaan. They're both mentioned in the Bible. They're both the significant modes of transportation. There's one more place that we ought to mention, but it spans the Jordan River, and it was not always navigable, and that's the coastal roads. Let's see if I can do that again. I guess that isn't going to allow me to keep that name of Jericho there. Notice we have Megiddo that watched over the way of the sea, or the way of the Philistines. And then I have that smaller road that goes past Jericho, but that's going to be a seasonal road, because every spring that road will be washed away by the Jordan River when the Jordan overflows its banks. Now I want to talk about the climate of Canaan. Canaan has something of what's been called a Mediterranean climate, where, at least supposedly on paper, it's never really too hot or never really too cold. Of course, there are exceptions to that. I've been in Galilee, by the Sea of Galilee, when temperatures reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, that was an exception. They were setting some heat records that year. So normally it's not going to be too hot or too cold. So we have a Mediterranean climate, and we have a climate that is dependent upon the winter rains. You see, you have what have been called early rains that start around October. Now, that doesn't mean they go away in November, but around October, the rains begin, the rainy season begins, and you'll have a bit more rain in November, a bit more in December, a bit more in January. In fact, January is probably the most rainy month of all. And it's not a downpour, but there's more rain than you've seen in a while. And then February, March, and April, it begins to taper off, so that in late April, you see the last of your rain, and by the time you hit May, it doesn't rain at all, except perhaps a little bit just on the coast. So that May and June and July and August and September are completely dry with not a bit of rain, or very rare does it rain. And then the following October, you begin again with the early rains. So you're going to have your rainfall primarily in the wintertime, your dry season in the summer. Now, let me ask one closing question. Actually, I'm going to turn it into two, but let's start off. What is the big idea of the Old Testament? A lot of things have been proposed, and usually in class I allow some discussion, and folks will come up with the idea, well, maybe it's prophetic, looking at Jesus, and that's true, or it's the history of Israel, and that's true. But let me suggest the big idea of the Old Testament, beyond which there is none bigger. Here it is. The big idea of the Old Testament is that Yahweh is Lord. In fact, the Shema, that passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6:4, says that. It's called the Shema because it starts off in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, and the way you say is Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone, however you want to translate that. So that the big idea of the Old Testament is that Yahweh is Lord. Now that brings us to another question. We're really not going to discuss that much in this class because this is going to be a class in the Old Testament. But we have to ask the question, what's the big idea of the New Testament? And if the big idea of the Old Testament is that that Yahweh is Lord, I just gave it away, sorry. The big idea of the New Testament is that Jesus is Lord. And that's going to be repeated a number of times verbatim in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, I find out that Yahweh is Lord. In the New Testament, I find out that Jesus is Lord. And that's going to tell us a bit of who Jesus is. You think about that.